Hi, welcome to Digital Defense. I am your host, Jordan Robertson, broadcasting to you live from the Bloomberg News Bureau in Washington, D.C. This is our weekly cybersecurity and digital privacy show. I am a reporter with Bloomberg News here in Washington. I've been covering cybersecurity for over a decade, and we envision this show as kind of a collaborative platform where you're able to ask questions, send in comments, and talk about security and privacy news of the week, and really try to offer you practical advice for interpreting the week's news and keeping you up to speed on the latest security and privacy threats. So what we want to talk about this week is the FBI is warning that that there is a wave of cash-out fraud coming. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means to have these ATM hacks occurring. They've occurred in other parts of the world. The FBI is warning that there is a planned attack on the U.S. In this regard. So I want to talk about what that may mean for those of us who who use ATMs and who have bank accounts and credit cards and such, and talk to you a little bit about how you can protect yourself or try to protect yourself against this type of fraud. So just taking a big step back, this, and I should mention as well that, while we're on air, if you have any questions, we do welcome them. I do get a real-time feed of them, and we answer as many of them as we can get through in the time that we have here. So please feel free to type those in wherever you're watching the show, whether that's the Bloomberg terminal, Facebook or YouTube or Periscope or any of the other platforms, where we are. We love to get the questions and we love to answer them. So here's what an ATM cash-out fraud is. Here's what the FBI warned about this week. The FBI warned that cyber criminals, as you can see in the story behind us from a website called Krebs on Security, a really great investigative cybersecurity journalist named Brian Krebs, who's been doing this a long time and has some really great sources. Brian Krebs got his hands on an FBI alert that went out to large banks and payment processors, payment card processors, saying, hey, the FBI has intelligence that there's going to be a large-scale attack on the U.S. Involving ATM machines. And these are not your ordinary kind of steal a credit card number, and charge illicit goods to your account type of fraud. These are really sophisticated frauds that the FBI is warning, could affect a number of U.S. banks and payment card processors. That's why they're warning them. And what happens in an ATM cash-out fraud is essentially this. Hackers will do two things. One, they will steal individuals' card numbers, PIN codes, any other validation data that they need. So they will steal that information either from a bank or a payment card processor or just elsewhere on the web, tricking people into entering that information into, fake web forms and such. They will have that information and they will create, what are essentially cloned ATM cards. So this is where kind of this intersects with those of us, who are not criminals, who might be concerned about this type of fraud. What a hacker will essentially do is steal your card information from somewhere on the internet and create a cloned ATM card. So somebody could be walking around with an ATM card that functions exactly as yours does. And they may even have the PIN code and other private data needed to withdraw money from your account. But the attack doesn't end there. An ATM cash-out fraud, I'm sure a lot of people watching this show, kind of have the same response, ordinary people do, which is, okay, somebody clones my ATM card. That's going to be really bad. That's not where all your money should be anyway. I mean, if you have money, if you're lucky enough to have any money, you don't keep it in your checking account. Like, that's just not prudent financial planning. So what's the big deal with a cash-out fraud? Well, there's a second phase to it. What the criminals do is they not only steal your banking information, but they also hack either the bank or the payment card processor that bank uses. And they jack up the withdrawal rates, and they also inflate the accounts. And so they do those things so that when the time for the attack comes, this is very sophisticated stuff. I mean, this is not kind of low-level cybercrime, script kiddie hacking. This is really serious stuff. They will inflate the value of a target's account, temporarily, and they will also, through hacking the back-end banking systems, increase the withdrawal limit, because most of us will have a withdrawal limit on our accounts. So instead of $5,000, they'll say you can withdraw $500,000 today. And again, because it's a hack of the bank system, and because it's kind of a one-time attack, one-time massive attack, where these people called money mules go out to the ATMs, withdraw the money, and they keep a cut of it. The bank has, there's very high likelihood the bank is caught unaware that their systems are compromised. So the FBI, you can kind of read between the lines. The FBI is working very hard, on the back end to ensure that banks have the information they need to prevent this type of attack. But for those of us who are kind of ordinary consumers walking around with debit card in our pocket, what are we supposed to do? So it sounds like these are back-end infrastructure hacks. There's nothing we as consumers can do to stop that. If they've cloned my ATM card and they've pre-authorized withdrawals from my bank account, protecting your PIN code, if they have that too, there's not a whole lot you can do there, but there are some things you can do to be aware of the potential for this type of hack against your account, and we're going to go into that in just a little bit. So we're getting some questions in, so before I get to kind of the tips and tricks that are what we hope are kind of a key takeaway of this show, I do want to get to some of these questions. As I said earlier, feel free to send in any questions wherever you're watching the show. We do appreciate them. We do think they're really valuable, and we hope that they help you, think about some of these issues. So we've got a couple of these questions coming in, and I'm going to flip to the next slide. The first question is this just in the U.S. or elsewhere? We'll show you. This is a foreign ATM. I believe it's Japan. And this is what a foreign ATM looks like after one of these withdrawal attacks. So in response to the viewer's question, this is not just the U.S. In fact, there was a very large ATM withdrawal attack in India recently. And what happened in India was exactly what the FBI is warning is believed to be planned to happen here, which is criminals hacked some banking infrastructure, stole a bunch of debit card information, created cloned cards, and withdrew millions of dollars, the equivalent of millions of dollars from these ATMs. This is very, very serious business. You don't invest in the time and effort and skill it takes to hack a bank. These banks are prepared for these kinds of attacks. They're very serious type of hacks. You don't do all that to get a few $1,000s. You do it to get a few million or more. So India was hit by one of these attacks. We've seen this around the world where the U.S. It's happened in the U.S. as well. So we've seen this around the world where part of the reason that some of these cash out frauds are localized to a geography like India or the U.S. or wherever is there's a physical aspect to these attacks that can't be lost on us as ordinary consumers, which makes these attacks harder. And that physical aspect is these hackers, for this attack to work, these hackers need people who are on the ground inserting these cloned ATM cards into the ATMs and pressing the right buttons to withdraw a bunch of money. So this requires a huge operation that can't just be done with a click of a mouse. You need people on the ground to facilitate these attacks, and it's just a lot easier logistically from the hacker's perspective to keep that confined to a geography because that's where the hack has occurred, that's where the stolen data is, and that's where it's going to be easiest to manage what they call the money mules, whose job it is to cash out of these ATMs. So very complicated process. The good news about that is it makes it a lot harder to do these attacks. The bad news is if the attackers are skilled enough and advanced enough to get these attacks rolling and in flight, they can also be very hard to stop because these are very persistent, committed, skilled adversaries. And that's why the FBI issued the warning that it did. Next question here. This has been going on in Europe for a while. That's correct. What are they doing there to prevent it? Well, in response to that question is this is a very hard problem. One of the things that authorities have been doing is, as many of us are aware, they've been adding a chip to a card. So when you add a chip to a card, what that essentially does is it's an additional layer of authentication that this card is the authentic one and not a cloned card. So, in theory, that is a good thing. However, in practice, what effectively that's done is that just transfers liability, from the bank, which is ultimately going to be responsible for replenishing people's accounts, to the retailer or whoever has accepted that card, if they accept it without the chip in place. It's kind of a sidebar. But what authorities are trying to do in Europe and elsewhere to prevent these kinds of fraud is, number one, they're trying to improve the cybersecurity of banking, not just banks' networks, because the banks have a lot of attention from authorities. They have been, as long as hacking has been an issue for them. Where a lot of these threats lie are kind of the third-party intermediary networks that exist in the banking system. And what I mean by that is, it's going to be really hard to hack into Bank of America, let's say, just to pull one out of thin air. There are a lot of eyes on that infrastructure. But to the extent that a bank uses third-party payment processors, and all of them do. I mean, these payment processors exist everywhere and in multiple forms. That's where a lot of these vulnerabilities lie. And as the news story this week pointed out, a hack of a payment card processor, in theory, is going to be easier than a hack of the bank, the too big to fail type banks. And if you can alter information there and then connect it to the right accounts, you can make millions of dollars. So what authorities are doing is they're trying to shore up the security of those kind of third-party entities. And that is no small task. There are lots and lots and lots of players in the financial system that are not the too big to fail entities. So the short answer to this viewer's question is that's a big responsibility and that's a big undertaking that authorities in Europe and the US and elsewhere are trying to manage, which is, as you go down the food chain, you can get smaller and smaller organizations that are involved in processing payments, in distributing ATMs, in managing the software for those networks. There are lots and lots. It's the supply chain problem for a lot of these organizations. And the well-timed, well-placed attack at one of those vulnerable organizations, will allow the hacker to facilitate these attacks. So that's a key thing that they're doing. And also just awareness around, hey, these attacks do happen. Banks try their best to stop them, but sometimes they're caught off guard as well. So if you log into your bank account, and this is where I want to get to some of the tips and tricks. We've got some great questions coming in as well. I'll get to more of those in a minute. Please keep them coming in. There needs to be more awareness around, hey, if you log into your bank accounts and you had $100 there yesterday, and now that $100 is gone, and it said your account was, withdrawn for $50,000 or whatever, needless to say, the bank is going to be aware of that, but you as a consumer need to be aware of what may have happened, because otherwise you think the bank has screwed up. The bank has somehow made a catastrophic error with your account, and any of us would be terrified to log into your account and see just, not only is it drained, but there is such bizarre behavior happening with the account. The bank's responsibility is to make you whole again, but these types of attacks also have some sort of, there's a panic risk as well, that when consumers see their accounts have been drained, do you trust the financial system? There's a real danger there of that. So I think awareness is also another response to this, because this is just a result, of existing in the modern kind of digital economy. These things will happen. As a consumer, you should be empowered by knowing that if these kinds of things happen to you, and if it's unfortunate but it happens to you, that not only is the bank going to make your money whole, which is the law, in the U.S. for under a certain amount. I think it's $250,000. You're insured by the federal government, but elsewhere as well. So those are the two main things that governments are trying to do. In terms of practical advice, so what should you do to try to protect yourself from these types of attacks? The first one, as I say, you can't protect the bank's network. That is nothing that any of us ordinary, citizens can do. So you can forget about that right now. You can do your best to protect your PIN code and things like that, but again, that's not really the crux of these attacks. If hackers are able to get into the bank's back-end systems, they're able to authorize a lot of things that your PIN code will not protect against. So your best bet, like the smartest people I know on this topic, your best bet is to set up all the authentication you can to your account, whether it's a PIN code, whether it's a text message alert if somebody logs into your account remotely, things like that. Get email alerts whenever you sign up for email alerts whenever there's a withdrawal or a transaction on your account, and just keep an eye on your account. May not be satisfying advice, but for protecting against these types of attacks is actually some of the best advice, which is keep an eye on your account. Sign up for email and text alerts for any kind of transaction. Log into your account daily or weekly or whatever, periodically, and keep an eye out for suspicious transactions, because you're going to be a lot better off if you spot the transaction yourself, you're able to alert the bank, and before it's kind of a crisis moment where you need to pay the rent or pay the mortgage or pay the tuition, and you don't have money, your awareness ahead of time will go a long way in protecting you. Next question here. We're getting lots of good ones. Thank you for sending these in. What preventative measures are being taken? Is the FBI doing anything? Yeah, the FBI is working, as we can tell, from the leaked document. The FBI is working very closely with the major financial systems, to try and detect any unauthorized incursions into their networks. The FBI working in concert with the NSA. Obviously has lots of ways to do that, but that's not the end of the story. I mean, there's a lot of preventative work that can be done. But put it to you this way, if the FBI knew exactly where this attack was going to occur and it knew how to shut it down, it would have done that. It would have done that, or it would have worked with that particular financial institution to ensure that not only did the attack not affect consumers, but also that the U.S. authorities could have a good chance of catching the attackers. So, there would be an intelligence operation that would happen in concert with the bank and the authorities that would make that possible. What's happened here, my sense of what's happened here is the FBI and the NSA have very good intelligence about what is being planned, but in terms of operational details of where and when and how, that might be fuzzy. So what they're doing is they're warning banks, hey, beware of it. They're working with, the large critical infrastructure providers to share whatever information they have. But they're also, through these alerts, trying to alert members of the public as well that this is something that's going to happen. You need to be aware of it. Again, unlike on this show, I try to offer practical advice for what you can do to protect yourself. There isn't a whole lot of it in this case, except keeping an eye on your account. Because again, there's just we're not in charge of the bank's security. We're not in charge of, monitoring international communications that might indicate when or where or if this attack is going to take place. And that's a big thing I should say as well. There's a lot of scare tactic type stuff in cybersecurity. This story kind of comes pretty close to that. But I think the big takeaway is, A, this attack may not happen. The FBI's alert may have been about the attack in India that occurred and the Cashout attack there. There may be nothing that happens in the U.S. on a major scale, but if it does, I think the real key takeaway is that the banks by law are supposed to make you whole. Anything in your checking account under $250,000, is federally guaranteed. So. If you have more money than that in your checking account, I would probably say visit a financial advisor because they would tell you that's not a great idea. So that's kind of the answer to that. I mean, they're looking into it. They're trying to protect infrastructure, the FBI, and they're kind of waiting to see what the attackers do. And that's the state of things in cyber. If they could go arrest these guys, they probably would. But they may not be able to. Are the banks and other processors working to protect consumers? Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of sources inside these organizations, and the sense that you get is this is one of the biggest priorities for banks. I mean, cash out fraud is one of the top things that banks' security organizations look at and try to protect against. Not just because of the money, because a few $1 million is a huge attack. I mean, that's a big, haul for a hacker group. But for a bank, for a too big to fail bank, that's nothing. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. What the bank is more concerned about is trust and reputation and, the reliability of the U.S. financial system. So there's a lot of motivation there to try and, if not fully absorb the attack and block the attack, because that may be impossible, but to mitigate its impact. The idea being, if any of these kind of unauthorized abnormal behaviors like jacking up withdrawal rates and disabling certain security mechanisms, what they're looking at now, knowing what we know about how these organizations work, what they're looking at now is if any of those things start happening, that's our cue. That's our cue that the attack is happening. That's our cue that these attackers are getting ready to withdraw money. And it's at that point that law enforcement becomes really key, because you can catch the money mules. You can, in theory, look at what the hackers are doing and potentially even catch them. But the attack kind of has to start for that intelligence to be generated. Next question here is, do they bother with credit unions or just the big banks? Valid question. Credit, it doesn't matter. I mean, hackers, they target both. Hackers go wherever the weak link is in a system. If that weak link happens to be a credit union, if it's a single building credit union, that's going to be a little bit harder because you're going to have one opportunity to cash out. There might be one ATM at that credit union. So I should modify my answer by saying they target the weakest link, but they also target organizations that also have the opportunity for a large cash out potential, and that wouldn't necessarily be a single building credit union. Now, a network of credit unions, absolutely. A credit union that has multiple locations and multiple ATMs and dozens of facilities around a given region, yeah, that would absolutely be a great target. And so the point of all this is the U.S. We're really lucky. The U.S. has really great consumer protections around these things, and I say consumer protections specifically because small businesses tend to get screwed in some of these things, and Brian Krebs has written some really great stories about that as well. Topic for a different show. But if you're an ordinary consumer, you have an ordinary consumer checking or savings account or whatever, you are federally guaranteed up to that amount, which again, I could be wrong, but I believe it's $250,000. And that's a big level of protection against things like these. And that's just the federal guarantee. Many banks will simply replenish the account as if nothing happened because that's in the interest of their institution. You as a victim who has entrusted your money to a bank, you should not be forced to absorb the cost of the bank's kind of vulnerability that allowed this to happen. So many banks will just simply make the problem go away by replenishing the accounts. And that's a good thing. I mean, that is the role that those organizations should occupy. For us as consumers, the best thing we can do is just to be aware and to know that if the FBI is announcing this kind of thing quasi-publicly to the banks, by sending this alert to so many financial institutions, it is bound to get out, and it did. By doing that, they're also sending a message to the attackers like, hey, we're on to you. Like, we see what you're planning, and be very careful if you're going to try to pull this off as planned, because we're on to you, we're gonna destroy your networks. If this happens, we're going to catch your money mules. We might even catch you as the hacker. So there's a deterrent effect that the FBI, I would assume, is hoping for in kind of publicly announcing this information that I would hate for any viewers of the show to walk away with, like, being nervous or scared, like, oh, what if this happens to my account? It may not even happen. With any of these cyber attacks, this stuff may not even, come to pass. But what I want viewers of the show to know is that if something like this happens, if you see news stories, if you happen to read the stuff that's happened overseas in Europe or India or here in the U.S., previously, just to know that this isn't the end of the world if this happens to your account. It's certainly an inconvenience. It is certainly a violation. It should certainly cause you to kind of, rethink the organizations that you're banking with, especially if it's a smaller one that maybe, was found to not have great security. But I think, and this may be naive, I've been covering this sector a long time, but one thing I do know is when the government comes out with information publicly, the process to get that to happen is so long, is so convoluted, is so involved that, the government effectively believes at that point that there's a public interest in disclosing some of this information. And that may be because the operation may have already been rolled up. That's always a possibility in these things as well, that the reason some of this classified information becomes public is because the operation may be dead already. So that's kind of how to interpret that. And I hope that's one of the takeaways from this show kind of generally that regular viewers will get, is that's the way to read these stories as well, because there is kind of there's a trick to some of this language. And we're almost out of time here, but I do want to show you one more thing. So this is what it looks like when an ATM has been maxed out and is disabled. I can't do this story without bringing up Barnaby Jack. So Barnaby Jack he died a few years ago. He was a very famous hacker. He was most famous for this attack. He called it jackpotting. And what he did is he was on stage at Black Hat. Again, this was a number of years ago. But the idea being that he could remotely hack these ATMs, and he showed some specific vulnerabilities that allowed him to do that, to dispense money. And this is kind of like, for people in my industry, this is kind of like an iconic presentation. This is an iconic image of what it looks like when these ATM hacks happen this way. So I kind of wanted to bring that up just to say, this is something that security researchers have been talking about for a long time. This is something that, as one of the viewers pointed out, criminals, especially in Europe and elsewhere, have been engaged in exploiting for a number of years as well. And, Black Hat 2018 just ended in Vegas. There was lots of great research that came out. Viewers may have seen some of that research about hacking stock exchanges and things like that. And I wanted to bring up this picture just to remind people that when that research comes out, these researchers, in some cases, are years ahead of the criminals, because what you're talking about are some of the smartest, minds within the white hat hacker community. So, what Barnaby Jack presented, so many years ago on stage at Black Hat, now it's becoming a thing that is actually a real threat that is a big business for cyber criminals. So I bring that up just so you have something interesting to look at, but this stuff is not science fiction. This stuff is not even new. The industry has known about these threats for a long time. And, organizations that don't do enough to adequately protect their systems that, that may find themselves vulnerable to these things, what they can't do is claim we had no idea. And that's another takeaway I'd like for the audience today is, the industry has known about these issues for a long time, going back well before Barnaby Jack did this presentation. And, claiming ignorance of this potential vulnerability just really shouldn't fly with educated, consumers are educated about this. So with that, we're about out of time. Thank you so much for writing in with your questions. I hope I've answered them, to everybody's satisfaction. If you want to catch me offline, I'm on Twitter. It's at JordanR1000, Jordan, the letter R1000. Please feel free to send me any follow-up questions there. We're the website for the global technology team, which I'm a part of, is bloomberg.com/technology. You'll find links to this show, as well as lots of other great content there as well. With that, we're out of time. I want to thank everybody who helps makes this show possible, especially producer Pia Gadkari and the rest of the team that makes this show happen. Thanks so much for watching. We broadcast every week live at noon Eastern from the Bloomberg offices here in Washington. With that, we're signing off. Thanks for watching Digital Defense. We'll see you next week.